Something kicked off in Ukraine in the last 24 hours. Russia says it was a large counterattack, and Ukraine says, well, nothing. Throughout this war, Ukraine's been pretty good when it comes to operational security. There were some hiccups early right when the fighting kicked off, but for the most part, since then, they've kept things pretty close hold. What that means for now is that the majority of sources that we have are Russian. Now, I generally like to show what both sides are saying about any specific event, which is a part of the sit reps I put out on Substack, link below, but that's just not an option here, at least not yet. For months now, there's been a lot of anticipation about when and where Ukraine will attack, but the reality is that's entirely unknown. I mean, Ukraine has talked up this counteroffensive themselves, which gives a pretty good indication that it's going to happen at baseline, but beyond that, we're pretty much all in the dark. In turn, every little Ukrainian action over the last few weeks is pretty quickly labeled the start of the offensive, which is sort of expected in places like Twitter and Telegram, but this time it was a little bit different. The Russian Ministry of Defense announced that, quote, in the morning of June 4th, the enemy launched a large-scale offensive at 5 sections of the front in southern Donetsk by introducing into combat the 23rd and 31st Mechanized Brigades, end quote. They added that Ukraine was unsuccessful, having suffered heavy losses of men and equipment, and that General Gerasimov was at a forward command post while all this took place. The area that Russia's talking about here is generally from Volodar in the east to Zaporozhye in the west. This stretch is generally where most of the reports over the last 24 hours have talked about an uptick in Ukrainian activity. There were some images and videos put out on pro-Russian Telegram channels showing the destruction of some of this Ukrainian equipment. Now, Russia said that 2 Ukrainian brigades were used in this attack, but from all the footage I've seen, it doesn't look like anything more than maybe a company-sized element. Of course, I wouldn't expect 1 or 2 clips to be able to capture the entirety of the battlefield, but that's really all I can go off of right now. Now, initial reports, again from the Russian side, were that Ukrainian forces had pushed through the first line of defenses and forced the Russians to retreat. However, later in the day, those same Russian channels were saying the attack was repulsed entirely. And as of this morning, June 5th, Russian media announced that Ukraine was back on the attack and that up to 30 armored vehicles were able to advance to the line of contact without being noticed just west of Volodar, adding that, quote, this puts us in a difficult position. The situation is in development, end quote. Additionally, Alexander Khodorkovsky, a commander in the Russian separatist forces, stated, quote, the enemy, having felt our weak points, is stepping up efforts. For the first time, we saw leopards in our tactical area. As I expected yesterday, having a sense of success, the enemy will throw additional forces into battle, end quote. That sounds a lot more like probing attacks or a reconnaissance in force than the Ukrainian main effort of multiple brigades smashing into the Russian lines. And as I mentioned in a previous video, you're going to have a lot of folks really itching to jump to major conclusions from any little piece of news here. But realistically, it's going to be a long time before we have a clear understanding of the situation at the front and its overall impact to the war. There was also activity noted around Bakhmut and in the Belgorod region of Russia, but before getting into those, a few big picture thoughts here. I wouldn't take Ukrainian silence on these attacks to really mean much of anything. Even in Kharkiv this last fall, where they saw a pretty rapid success, official Ukrainian sources were really slow in releasing what was actually happening there. And Ukraine has every reason to want to be quiet about this. We know that Russian communication between units isn't great and have seen that play out recently on the outskirts of Bakhmut. And that seemingly little issue can be the thing that causes a major break in the line. So if Ukraine is successful in one or more areas, it's not really in their benefit to fill in those communication gaps for the Russians. Let the chaos reign. On the other hand, if they're unsuccessful, there's no way Ukraine is coming out right away to announce that. I mean, an operation the size of the offensive that's been talked about here, it's not over in a couple days or even a couple weeks. And let's be honest, throughout this war, neither side has ever really acknowledged a defeat. It's always a tactical withdrawal or a deliberate movement from one location to another. Now shifting a little east and north on the battlefield, in the Bakhmut area, Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin announced that Ukraine had retaken a village north of the city. I got to mention a few things real quick before I get into that. First, Wagner said recently they've withdrawn 99% of their forces from Bakhmut and have handed that area over almost entirely to Russian Ministry of Defense forces. We might find out in the next few days or weeks if that's accurate, but in the meantime, when announcing that 99%, Prigozhin said that his troops, the Wagner troops, uncovered landmines laid across their exit route from the city, which he said were placed there by Ministry of Defense forces. On top of that, Wagner recently released a video showing the commander of the Russian 72nd Brigade that they had captured, beaten, and forced to speak on camera about just what he had done. In the video, the Russian officer says that he fired upon a Wagner vehicle while he was drunk, and later that he disarmed a Wagner element that was operating in the area. So it'll be a little bit interesting to see what Russia's response is to this, but hard to imagine them just entirely letting this go. But needless to say, the tension continues to build between Wagner and the Ministry of Defense. All right, so early this morning, June 5th, Prigozhin put out that Ukrainian forces had recaptured Berkovka, a small village about 4 kilometers north of Bakhmut. Now, Prigozhin says that the goal here, when Russian forces took over from Wagner, was to position themselves behind the reservoir so as to protect this very settlement. And Prigozhin goes on to tell Shoigu and Gerasimov that they should come to the front to lead the charge to take back the territory. And in the midst of an uptick in Ukrainian offensive operations all across the front, there's still an ongoing fight inside of Russia's border in Belgorod. A few weeks ago, the Russian Volunteer Corps, the Freedom of Russia Legion, and now we've learned the Polish Volunteer Corps, pushed across the border, kicking off a 1 to 2 day fight that grabbed quite a bit of attention. After moving back across the border into Ukraine, those groups have been pretty vocal about their desire to return to Russia and bring about their desired change. I still need to do some digging to understand the Polish Volunteer Corps, but you can check out recent videos on the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom of Russia Legion to learn about their goals and ideologies. Now, that border region has been under near daily artillery attacks for a while now, and over the last few days, the groups have announced that they once again pushed into Russia, with fighting taking place just southwest of Shebekino. Just like everything else in this war, the information around what's going on in Belgorod is messy at best. The Russian Ministry of Defense said that a recon group was detected but pushed back across the border by artillery. Shortly thereafter, another pro-Russian Telegram channel called Military Informant refuted that claim by saying, quote, "Despite the statements of the Ministry of Defense, the enemy posted footage of the successful invasion of the village yesterday and being in it. The enemy was able to make a breakthrough and occupy the outskirts of Novaya Tavozanka and also captured several Russian soldiers," adding, quote, "Why, in a situation of constant attempts of Ukrainian forces to break through into Russian territory, try to hide your head in the sand and pretend nothing is happening is a mystery to us," end quote. Now, there's a map floating around the last few days that I think is worth mentioning here. While it does seem likely that forces have pushed into Russia, I think their progress might be a little overblown. This map makes it look like 10 to 20 kilometers in certain areas are contested, and the Ukrainian aligned forces are in control of significant chunks of territory. In reality, I think it's safe to say that the larger area here, both green and white, has been under sporadic artillery fire, but the control of that territory hasn't exactly changed hands. More likely, some of the green here shows the furthest that some of these groups have pushed at times, but as of today, it hasn't been completely taken over. The one exception would be this little carve out in dark green where elements of the RVC, FRL, and PVC may have been able to dig in a little bit. Bottom line, however this gets spun, there's active fighting going on inside of Russian territory. That's a big deal for any country. And while it's not clear how this news is being received across the general Russian population, it's not something that can be ignored entirely. And it'll be interesting over the next few weeks and months to see how this plays into Russian force posture and troop disposition. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out the new Substack for regular sit reps on the war in Ukraine, China, terrorism, and all things national security. We'll see y'all next time.